Hello, and welcome to my talk about building dialogue tools for designers through multiple stages of development. My name is Francis. I love a good roguelike. I enjoy craft beer, and I own a cat called Zucchini. If you want to see my cat, I just posted a pic on Twitter, which is conveniently located at the bottom of my slides. So thank you for coming. Before we get into my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what I do, so you have a little bit of context about what to expect from this talk. I currently work as a gameplay programmer at Studio Mayday here in Wellington. I'm part of a tech team of 3, and I've been in my current role for 2.5 years. Before I worked at Mayday, I was part of Little Lost Fox, which is a company myself and some friends founded to make Valleys Between. Valleys Between was a mobile game which we categorised as an endless puzzler, and I did pretty well, and we are very proud of it. So what is this talk about? My takeaways section said, audience members should expect to learn practical applications and advice about the do's and don'ts for supporting the dialogue goals of designers and writers on a project. But in reality, really this talk will be walking you through my practical experience building a dialogue system for a team of designers throughout different stages of pre-production. Who will benefit the most from this talk? Junior programmers are going to learn the most from this talk. When I did this, I've been in the industry about 2 years, and at that time I had never built a design-facing system of this scale. If you're a designer working with programmers, hopefully this will give you some insight onto the goings-on over on the code team, and hopefully it'll help you anticipate some of your needs so that when it comes time to implement dialogue in your game, you can give the code team as full of an idea of what you want as possible. And finally, anyone looking to implement dialogue. Although this is a talk from a programmer about building a system to support designers, it's not very code heavy, so hopefully there are things that you pick up that you didn't consider, and maybe even things that you want to implement in your system. So a quick breakdown, and I see that some of my slides have been cut a bit short going from Google to Microsoft, so sorry about that. I'm going to start talking you through our dialogue V1. Then I'm going to talk about some of the expectations people have of a dialogue system. Then I'm going to break down the improvements we made going from V1 to V2. And then I'm going to talk about integrating external dialogue tools into your pipeline. Finally, if there's time, I'll talk about UI considerations, but I suspect there might not be. So dialogue V1. When you're starting on a project, you'll probably know ahead of time if your project is going to have dialogue. Dialogue is somewhat of a known quantity in a game. The designers and team are already going to have an understanding of how important dialogue is to the player experience and the role it's going to play in the project. Even with this foresight, it is likely that you and even the design team don't have a full picture of the requirements of the system. But that's okay, this process is iterative. At Mayday, we certainly didn't have a full picture of what we would be involved and what our requirements of dialogue would be. Because of that, at this point, it was more like a dialogue 0.1. At this time, we were in prototyping and exploring other systems, and it got to the point where the team was like, hey, we want our player to talk to an NPC. There wasn't really much more information or expectations than that at the time. So the first pass was going to look something like this. It was very basic, a fixed UI, and by that I mean a dedicated screen space for dialogue text. Speaker details displayed, maybe an icon, just a very simple way to display dialogue to the player. Here I'll go through some of the components that make up the tools, starting with dialogue nodes. Dialogue nodes are responsible for putting text on the screen. Each node was a self-contained package of dialogue. They had input for different speakers to seamlessly update the UI between conversation participants. They had display controls for different portraits and other speaker details. Derived nodes made it easy to provide additional functionality as required while using the existing framework. And we had branching from player choice. You could pick which node came next in a sequence and offer questions to the player, using that player input to determine which node would come next, providing the all-important branching dialogue. So this is what the output looked like. We have a main body of text, the meat of the dialogue, and then we have player options on the right, which could lead them down different branches. Here we can also see the name of the NPC, in this case, Sven. So it all seems pretty good. Who would have thought I'd have nailed it first try? And I know what you're thinking. This all sounds brilliant, and you're wondering what could have gone so wrong that it's not still around today. Because spoilers, this system didn't last very long. And that is 100% because it looked like this. This is the tooling I provided to design. In short, nested dialogue nodes forming a linked list. It's actually way worse than what it appears here. I recreated this for the screenshot. The original is probably 2 years old, and I stripped a lot of information out to keep it contained to one slide. So yeah, the original tool took up about 3 times this space. As you can see, or maybe not see, there's actually only 3 dialogue nodes contained in this picture. My favourite part, I think, or the worst part, is that when a question node was put in, it was nestled between the 2 responses, meaning that if we extended the branch down response 2's path, any following dialogue nodes would appear above the question. So obviously there were some learnings from this iteration. I think it's an important step of software development to take time to evaluate how a system is working as a whole, not only evaluating functionality, as some programmers tend to do, but also taking a look at the usability of the system. Using V1 as an example, we can see that it met a lot of the functionality goals. It was, after all, putting branching narrative on the screen. However, the usability was so bad, it made the solution almost unusable. So now it's time to talk about some of the learnings we took away from V1. It was very hard to get into the groove when creating dialogue, navigating the fiddly UI to add new nodes and then populate the speaker info for each new node before even adding the dialogue text led to a very slow and clunky environment to work in. This all added up to a lack of flow during content creation. There was no tree visualization. It was hard to follow any particular branch after a question was asked. Having collapsed nodes, which could have hundreds of dialogue nodes, all potentially containing additional branches, made it quite difficult to follow what was happening in a conversation. This is particularly bad when you consider that dialogue is not made by one person. Digging into the nodes built by someone else to figure out the flow of a conversation was a difficult and time-consuming task. For some of the earlier reasons, making changes to the dialogue tree was very difficult. In addition, you could easily delete things. Having nodes containing all following dialogue meant that deleting one node was potentially deleting hundreds of nodes. Ultimately, I learned from V1 that a dialogue system had more components than just putting text on the screen. How designers build their content is important, but also how designers tell their stories is equally as important. Designers are going to want to trigger events during dialogue. They're going to want to interact with every system you have ever built or while the player is engaged in dialogue. Narrative designers are going to want to tell a story. They have a scene in their head that you need to provide a framework to achieve. Now sure, some scenes will have big sweeping camera cuts that will have multiple characters interacting with each other and the world. For example, a fight scene. Something like this is outside the scope of what a dialogue system is meant to be capable of. However, there are a few things that a dialogue system should be capable of doing. The first thing dialogue should be able to do is interact with the player, modifying player stats, giving items, upgrading boots. If these sorts of things are in your game, the designers will want dialogue to do it. Storytellers want to play character animations on the player. Having the player play basic animations during dialogue can add a lot to the immersion of the narrative being portrayed. And it's not just animations on the player, but animations on every character in the dialogue. Storytellers want dialogue to be able to interact with the world. Just like pushing animations onto a participant, they want to animate and interact with objects in the world. They want to close doors and open chests and even move characters around. What this means is that there needs to be something which can communicate from your dialogue with physical actors and objects in your levels. A dialogue system might need to query the inventory to provide additional dialogue paths. They might want to give or take items from the player. Having this happen during your dialogue rather than at the start or at the end might be important if you want to show real-time UI notifications to them. Or if you're removing a piece of armor from a character in the scene, this should update in real time. Finally, they want to interact with the quest system. So these last two are pretty similar. Really, these two are representative of the systems which you have in your game with which the dialogue could be expected to interact with. In this quest example, the storytellers want to be able to start, update, and complete quests all from within the dialogue system. So eventually, it came time to revisit dialogue tools. This time around, how the designers created their content and told the stories were the most important considerations. And oh boy, there was more information and expectations this time around. So first up, we have a list of major goals to achieve. The designers wanted to be able to author interactions on other objects. They wanted to open those doors and chests. They even wanted to direct characters to new locations. They wanted improved control over the world to tell their stories. It became apparent that being able to flow when creating dialogue is very important. So having a less fiddly UI is a critical step on the way to achieving this. Removing as many barriers to making a new line of dialogue was critical. Visualizing the tree is very important to follow how conversations will progress, especially if you have multiple answers or multiple conditions, creating quite complex conversation branches. Enabling the team to see at a glance what branch the dialogue would follow and why is very important when creating a winding narrative. This is because it makes it easy to modify narrative content in branches. If a branch of dialogue needs to move, design should be able to rearrange the tree in order to make it fit. For example, going back and gating a branch behind a quest, or removing the need for a specific item should be a quick and easy process. So all of these major goals revolve around improving the creation pipeline for designers. Everything you see in the upcoming examples will be taking steps to achieve these goals. Just a heads up, we were working in Unreal Engine at the time, so we leveraged the blueprint graphs to our advantage, and you'll be seeing a few examples ripped from Engine. So this is the main text node. Functionally, very similar to V1, although there are major differences under the hood, the outcome was quite similar. This main text node takes a sentence structure and displays it on the screen. This is what the main text looked like. Really, this is the bread and butter of any dialogue system, displaying text onto the screen with some sort of formatting variables, again, using our guy Sven. This was our question node. On the right, we see a branching node. Simply put, it presents the player with two options, having each of these options divert the player down a different path. In the green, we can see two dialogue text packets containing basic formatting info along with the content. These are going to be the responses the player has to choose from. Then on the right, we can see in the red outline, we can see two responses leading off in different directions. So for example, here we can see how those paths might flow into different branches. Here is a small example tree. Just to break it down, we have a start dialog event in red. We have two main text nodes, and then it leads into an exit dialog node, which cleans up the UI and exits the conversation. We loosely played around with having these dialog nodes outside of a tree, but we found it was easiest to keep everything nicely contained. Here is a small example using a branching question node. The NPC is asking the player if they would like a potato, and you can see the three main text nodes leading into a question and then branching based on the player response. And here we have it coming together. Multiple lines of dialogue from different participants, a question followed by the appropriate response from the player. This in-engine system was flexible enough during the current stage of development that it stayed with us for over a year. Before we move on to the takeaways from V2, a large reason this system stayed with us for so long was the flexibility it provided. A large part of that flexibility came from easy access to the game world. And what do I mean by that? Being able to execute scripted events in the game via the dialogue tree, effectively having animations play on characters, having doors open or moving characters around. There are a few different ways to achieve this, but our approach looked something like this. If a dialogue tree needed to interact with the world, it would know which NPC would be using the dialogue tree. Let's say the NPC is called Bob. So the dialogue tree can cast to its owner Bob and call methods from Bob. In cases like this, the NPC had references to the other game objects in the world that the dialogue tree needed to interact with. If a building needed to fall down behind Bob, Bob would have a reference to that building and expose a method to the dialogue tree to make that happen. It was great for storytellers since both the NPC and dialogue trees had blueprint graphs. Authoring small interactions and scenes was very easy and intuitive to people who are familiar with blueprints. As an example, that interaction might look something like this. So from the dialogue tree, we have a main text node, and then we have an open door node exposed from Bob. So now moving on to some of the takeaways we had from V2. It does not scale well. First and foremost, it doesn't scale well. It was really good to build simple conversations, but when it came to larger conversations with multiple checks and branches, they looked something like this. This is an example of a conversation between the player and one NPC. It has about 30 to 40 lines across all of the different branches. Each one of those small squares is a dialogue node. You can see it's broken up into sections. All of these sections came from the branching nature of the dialogue. One of the major issues is that this system couldn't support nested dialogue trees. All dialogue had to be laid out in a single graph. As you can see from this long-sized conversation, the dialogue tree becomes quite difficult to use as it grows. There was tight coupling when the dialogue tree wants to interact with the world. Extremely tight coupling between the dialogue tree and NPC. A dialogue tree that wants to interact with the world couldn't function without that specific NPC, which means that you can't reuse the dialogue trees in other levels or with other NPCs. Trying to move the NPC to a different level would break the references as well. A slew of issues came from this tight coupling. Reiterating this again, this gave the team so much flexibility. It was very easy to build small conversations and interactions. The system had easy access to world events and interactions. Being able to build it in a blueprint graph also means being able to breakpoint and debug when things aren't working as expected. So now it comes to dialogue tool integration. Because of some of the issues, we started looking externally. Writers and designers do not want to generate content in engine. Being able to write dialogue smoothly in a tool designed just for writing dialogue is very useful and powerful. The design team played around with a few different tools, such as Inklewriter, which is a tool which keeps the branching narrative organised so that designers can focus on the writing and content. We also looked at Yarnspinner, which is a very similar tool to Inklewriter. Alongside that, we saw people building text in Word and plain text editors, and more commonly, Excel and CSV. Other than the first two, So I'm just going to quickly touch on things external tools do very well. In the examples like Inklewriter, they allow writers to visualize and build complex branching dialogue in isolation from the engine. The larger our dialogue trees got, the harder they were to maintain, and a tool specifically made to handle large complex dialogue systems can be a huge time save for both content generation and testing. External tools can also be very helpful if you're going to contract out your narrative work. Supporting an external tool in your game will go a long way in streamlining the process of importing dialogue into your game. External tools are very powerful and useful, so why might teams not want to use them? External tools are not always going to be an appropriate fit for your game. This section is not really ours, but just things to consider when exploring external tool usage. So the major one is going to be integration time. The more complex the tool, the tougher it is to integrate. I think the decision of if you want to use external tools or not mostly comes down to this factor. Will the accumulative time saved on the project by using this tool be greater than the time taken to integrate and maintain the systems? If you trigger events from the dialogue tool or have the dialogue tool update quests, these sorts of things take time. Here are a few examples of things which might eat up your time. Linking lines to characters and game objects. It works well for a UI with a dedicated place on the screen, but not so good for free-range UI which isn't always in the same place. It's easy enough to link up the UI with the thing the player is talking to and the player itself, but what if you're talking to 5 NPCs? Something like that. How to get the world location of those objects to position your UI. Integrating the dialogue with the world. Similar to the issues with UI linking, something as simple as opening the door becomes quite complex. When you start considering how the external tool will noodle its way in to call a function on a game object. The tech team will have to handle these pieces of custom interaction. Sure, there are some quite broad catching things, but there will be overhead on those, and any edge cases will fall back on the tech team to handle. And then integrating the world with dialogue. It sounds similar to the others, but instead of one-way communication to the dialogue, the dialogue also needs to know about goings-on in the world. Some situations are easier than others. For example, interaction with the inventory can be quite straightforward. Quests, on the other hand, are a little bit more complex. Querying the exact state of a specific step in a quest is somewhat more complex, let alone trying to ask if a door in the world is open or closed. These are some of the weaknesses of external tools, but obviously the decision to integrate external tools into your pipeline is a lot more complex. If you have a code-heavy team with the bandwidth to support and integrate these systems, this could be a huge win on time. So I'm quickly going to go through, this is the last section for the talk, I'm going to go through about UI considerations, because during our pre-production we went through a lot of different UI layouts. We really just tried a bunch of stuff. If you're looking to build a dialogue system for prototyping, here are some UI screen elements and things that you should consider when building your systems. So this is the classic UI. Name at the top, body of text underneath. The first thing to think about is communication from the UI back to the dialogue tree. As simple as the player pushing A and having the dialogue progress to the next line. Other things to consider, will the player and the NPC be using the same widget layout? Will the name be on the same side for both? Or will the screen be swapping sides? How will the dialogue dictate to the UI which side to use? In World UI, when you're talking to an NPC, they have an overhead text box like this in-game, or in the like this example here, or the earlier one, a short hike. It's pretty straightforward when there's just one NPC involved, but when you have multiple NPCs involved in a conversation, these things start to get a lot more complex. I was going to use this example from RuneScape to talk about character portraits, but my boss gave me permission to use this example from an earlier build. So here you have Sven. Some of you might have noticed mention of emotions throughout the node examples. This is what they were for. A lot of games utilize character portraits in their UI. They certainly add a lot to the conversation. The main takeaway for this is not something strictly related to portraits, but really any additional thing you want your UI to display above the text. Each additional thing you have on your UI bulks out the parameters for the dialogue that the dialogue nodes need to expose in order to display a line of dialogue. On just this screen, we have a character, which is a name and a portrait, and to drive this you may need maybe an icon set and parameters to display those. After that, there is the body of text, which also comes with alignment and formatting details. Even in this small example, we have a bunch of parameters to consider. Next up, if you have multiple options, and by multiple options I mean more than two, having buttons like we do becomes more difficult in terms of a nice looking UI. A lot of games resort to lists. Here in Fallout 3 we can see that to support their skill check options and faction options, the dialogue is built with a scroll box to support essentially as many options as they need. But unless narrative dense games, keeping the UI streamlined probably has a higher priority. Quickly, I'm going to go over some text effects. There are a lot of different text effects. What your UI supports is up to your team's needs, and how you empower your storytellers is up to you. Here are a few examples of things to expect. A common approach for a lot of these is something like markup text with some pre-processing by the UI. I think one of the more difficult things someone might ask of you is a position offset on an individual word in a sentence. Have fun with this one. A quick Google revealed interesting examples where each letter was its own widget. You can probably get away without supporting that though. So in summary, here are some take-homes for you. When building a design-facing system, a tool for designers, usability is a top priority. When it comes down to it, usability will probably trump most things when it comes to something like a dialogue tool. The more time someone spends fighting with a tool rather than using it is time not spent creating. Building tools to empower people is important. Like I said before, people who want to write dialogue for games want to tell stories in games. The more your tooling can support those goals, the better. Consider the role dialogue has in your game. This is more of a high-level one, but if all you need is a straightforward way to present dialogue to the player, don't overdo it. Make sure that your tool matches your needs. And finally, this process is iterative. Right at the start, before V1, I mentioned that there was not much information or expectations other than we wanted the player to talk to an NPC. And that's true. We didn't know what we needed our dialogue system to do. It was a journey of discovery that is still happening today. Thank you.